you so much, Ron. That introduction was so much nicer than what I was going to do for our speaker. So now I'm embarrassed. It is really a pleasure to be able to support the World War II History Roundtable and all efforts to promote historical engagement in our region. I encourage you to continue to come out. This is an amazing audience, and I don't want to keep you from this amazing talk any longer because Ron certainly did talk for long enough. So, that is not a dig at Ron. Great. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you tonight Dr. Adam Seipp, who is my dear friend from graduate school at the University of North Carolina, and what a pleasure to bring him here to Greenville to speak with you tonight. Dr. Seipp is Professor of History and Associate Dean for Graduate Studies in the College of Arts and Sciences at Texas A&M University, and that's the one in College Station. Right. He is the author or editor of several books on war and German society since 1945, and these include the one that Susan told you about, The Berlin Airlift and the Making of the Cold War, which you should totally buy afterwards, please read, and Strangers in the Wild Place, Refugees, Americans, and a German Town, 1945 to 1952. And he is currently working on a book-length social history of the American military presence in Germany after 1945, a preview of which you are about to hear. Thank you so much, Dr. Seipp.
Thank you so much, and it's just great to be here, and it's great to see an audience like this on a day where the weather was kind of iffy. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank the folks who invited me and who made this possible in no particular order, and I'm definitely going to skip some people. Skipper and Susan and Ron and all the folks at the museum, and I really want to extend a special thanks to Sharon, who welcomed me into her department at East Texas A&M today, and I'm learning. We're all learning. I got to meet some of her colleagues and her students, so it's just wonderful to be here and to share all of this with you. So I definitely, if you want to learn more about the Berlin Airlift, my editor will be very happy to know we had a cluster of sales in Greenville, Texas. So thank you very much in advance for that. But let's get to the story. On the night of September 11th, 1944, an American patrol slipped across the border between Germany and Luxembourg, right about there. They were the first American military personnel to cross the German border by land in the Second World War. I want to reflect just for a moment on that date, September 11th, 1944. That date is, of course, purely coincidental that that date later became infamous for something entirely different in American history, but I think it's entirely appropriate because I think this date actually reflects a critical turning point in the story of the American military in Europe and America's global role. What those men did not know that night was that the crossing of this border would represent a breach in that border, would represent the beginning of a dynamic that lasts more than 80 years and continues to this day, with more than 35,000 American military personnel still in Germany. And those of you who follow the news may know that the current U.S. administration is rethinking our force posture in Europe, and it's unclear what the future of that engagement is going to be, something I'd be happy to talk about more in the Q&A. But like I said, those men didn't know that night. They were fighting in a war that still had many terrible months to run, and many more would die. But this is an American story, and it has a distinctly American twist. The commander of that small patrol was this man, Staff Sergeant Werner Holzinger. And the name might indicate where I'm going with this, which is that Werner Holzinger was born in Silesia, that part of Germany that is now Poland. As a teenager, he and his family had come over to Wisconsin, which is where he would return after the war and live out the rest of his life. So the first encounter between Germans and Americans across that German border was in fact commanded by an American who himself came from Germany. This is an extraordinarily American story, and when I first encountered it, I thought, well, this is how I'm starting every talk from now until the end of forever. That story of Werner Holtzinger and 5 men crossing a border on a night in 1944 is, like I said, the entry point into a story that continues to this day, and that is indeed a part of the story that I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the very beginning of this, before we knew any of the things that we know now. There's a couple of things that I want you to take away from this lecture, even if you forget the name Werner Holtzinger, even if you forget any of the other things that I'm going to talk to you about tonight. The first is this: the end of war is not an event. The end of war is a process. It is a process. There is no magic moment. There is no moment at which the guns fall silent and everyone says, now is peace. The end of war is a process. It happens in different ways at different times, as armies move back and forth, as political transformation happens. It happens in geography, it happens in place, it happens in space, it happens in time. The ends of war, as I like to call them. The second is that the German-American interaction began even as the war was raging. A set of interactions that have continued for decades after that. The third point that I want to make is that we cannot understand either the German or the American reaction without looking at the other. We have to tell this as an entangled story. This isn't just a story about Germans and Americans. It is Germans working with, interacting with, engaging with, encountering Americans, and Americans doing likewise to the Germans. And the fourth point is this. I've already made it, but it's worth noting here. Nobody then knew what was going to happen next. That's the beauty of history. That's one of the reasons I find history so fascinating. We have to remember, they didn't know. They didn't know what was coming. They didn't know that this was going to be an 80-year story. And here, I want to stop and reflect for a moment on what this story kind of means and what it doesn't. And rarely do I do this, but I actually just changed my lecture slightly based on something I found right over there. I found a recruiting poster on one of the display cases with a photo of Audie Murphy. And it's a recruiting poster that focuses on Murphy's old division, the 3rd Infantry Division, the Rock of the Marne. And it encourages young men to join the army, to be part of Audie Murphy's unit, the Rock of the Marne, then serving in Würzburg, Germany. And it says, and I don't have a date for this, but I'd love to know when this poster was produced. It says, serve with your friends in the same unit, sightseeing on the Rhine, vacation in Berlin, Paris, Rome. Let's digest that for a second. My grandfather's generation encountered Germany as a shattered, defeated, morally, politically, intellectually bankrupt country that had committed crimes so terrible that new names would have to be developed to accommodate the horrors of the murder of civilians. My father's generation encountered Germany as a delightful place to spend one's time in military service. At least for my father, certainly better than the alternative, which was Vietnam. I grew up at the end of the Cold War and watched a reunited Germany still wrestling with the ghosts of its past. Just out of curiosity, in this room, how many people spent time in Germany as part of military service? Or, all right, I see one hand. Okay, 2. All right, good. This is a common story. This is not actually directly related to my lecture tonight, but I think it's really important. Between 1945 and 1995, 23 million Americans lived in the Federal Republic of Germany as military personnel, dependents, or civilian employees. 23 million. This is the biggest peacetime engagement between a military and a foreign society in human history. This should not have worked. And yet somehow it does. And the part of the story that I'm telling today is how we begin this story. A story that has not ended. Okay, that's how I wanted to start. That's what I want you to take away from this. So I'm going to give this lecture in a couple of different parts. I'm going to start by talking about how Americans first encountered Germans. I'm going to talk about Germans first encountering Americans. And then I'm going to talk about some of the places and spaces where these encounters happened. Let me stress here, there is no way I can do justice to the vastness of this story in the time that I have remaining to me. So I'm not even going to try. But I look forward to your questions, and we can talk about issues that I don't bring up, because there's going to be a lot of those, and I recognize that. On the last day of World War II in Europe, 1.8 million American military personnel were in the pre-1939 borders of Germany. 1.8 million. A lot of Americans were in Germany in the first week of May 1945. Those Americans had crossed a shattered continent that had been destroyed by the Germans. A book that I highly recommend to people, Peter Caddick-Adams' recent book, Blood and Fire, Fire and Steel. My apologies. Fire and Steel. The best book on the end of the war, written from the Western perspective. It's terrific. It's one of those books that I read and I think, gosh, why couldn't I write that? Anyway, he makes this point really eloquently. Allied soldiers who fought their way across Europe fought through a universe of death. They saw their friends killed. They killed people. They encountered the crimes of the Nazi regime. They encountered concentration camps, forced labor facilities, euthanasia facilities, POW camps. They were angry, and with very, very, very good reason, and I do not want to diminish that one bit by what I'm about to say. There is no question that Americans came to Europe and came into Germany with blood on their minds. The journalist and novelist Helena Smith wrote an article near the end of the war in, of all places, Women's Home Companion. Not a place you would expect to have a war correspondent, but they did. And she writes about riding in a jeep with a group of American soldiers through a German town, having just seen women and children made homeless, begging in the streets. She writes, "By that time, I'd forgotten all about slaughtered Poles and my sympathy for these women, and the captain's face looked as long as mine felt. Suddenly, he told me in a strange, hard voice, 'Were you in Normandy?' I was. I saw what they did to our paratroopers. I don't feel sorry for any German." That strange, hard conscience, troubled voice was the voice of your sons in Germany. I thought of a saying that a man who is slow to anger is more terrible than any in his wrath. So let's establish right off the bat that Americans were angry by what they'd seen in Europe, and they blamed the Germans. But they also encountered a place that had itself been destroyed, and they encountered civilians who were suffering. And let us be clear, German cities were flattened in 1945. There is no big German city that wasn't destroyed, and most of those cities were destroyed to the tune of at least 75% of all the buildings in the city ruined. These are just two images. The one on the far end is Dusseldorf, American troops moving through Dusseldorf. This is Mannheim. And this photo, incidentally, the photographer is a man named John Hoot, who left his photos to the University of North Texas. And I got this from the Portal to Texas History Project, so you can see a lot of his other photos in this. They were moving through a devastated landscape, and it was very, very hard for Americans not to feel some measure of sympathy for the destroyed cities of Germany and for the people made homeless and desperate therein. Saul Padover, a Jewish immigrant from Vienna who'd come to the United States, gotten an education, went back to Germany as a soldier. Published a memoir shortly after the end of the war in which he said, I think quite perceptively, in sum, the GIs feel that if there weren't so many men in Germany, it wouldn't be such a bad country. And when they return home, they can be expected to bring with them sympathy for German women, a sympathy that may well be translated into political terms of not being too harsh with the Reich as a whole. This brings up a really fundamental point. German society in 1945 was deeply traumatized by the events of the war, and I mean traumatized in demographic terms. Broadly speaking, in population biology, a population is roughly 50% male and 50% female. When that gets out of whack, something deeply weird is happening. And in 1945, approximately 56% of the German population were women. And even that conceals more than it reveals. Most of the men of military age had gone off to serve. They were dead. They were missing. They were in an internment camp. It was truly, as another of our graduate school classmates termed it in her brilliant book, the hour of the woman. The German society that Americans encountered was heavily overweighted toward women and children, and it was very hard for young American GIs to hate women and children. On top of that, they were young American GIs, and they were quite fond of the fact that there was a surplus of women of military age and a deficit of men of military age. Some of you may know that in the immediate aftermath of the war, there were official prohibitions against fraternization. No American was to have social contact with a German, including women and children. One of my favorite quotes about this was that it was the most widely ignored thing in American history other than prohibition. And by August, the Army had to admit that it was failing and had to cancel their own policy because they recognized that they were trying to enforce something that could not be enforced. I do not mean to be flippant when I say that the fact that German society was so fundamentally unsettled by the events of the war and this strange demography actually helps to explain why Americans fairly quickly moved from this attitude of belligerence, of vengeance, to one that was far more complicated, a sort of strange ambivalence. That's really important. Because if we're going to understand what happens next, again, we know what happens next, they didn't. We know that Germany would emerge as America's Cold War ally. But I think if we're going to understand the way that Germans and Americans reconcile, we have to think about that fundamentally weird moment at the beginning of the period of peace, the moment after at least some wars had ended. So let's turn our attention to how Germans reacted to Americans, because I think this is fascinating. And I've written about this, and I love talking about this. And I'm going to try to limit the amount of talking about it I do so I can talk about all the other stuff I want to talk about. Germans encountered Americans with absolute fascination. Americans were terrifying, but there was a moment at which the United States stopped being represented by bombers that dropped bombs and began to be represented by men and vehicles. There is no way to put this other than bluntly. Germans were blown away by how Americans looked. Keep in mind, Germany had been at war for 6 years. Before that, there had been a decade of wrenching depression. Germans were scrawny. They were used to cigarettes that smelled terrible and cheap gas that smelled worse. They had ill-fitting uniforms made out of synthetic fibers. German kids, this is hard to believe, many German children had never eaten chocolate because chocolate had been strictly rationed if it was available at all. The Americans were so big, and they had so many vehicles, and the vehicles worked, and the cigarettes tasted good, and the Americans had so much stuff that they would throw chocolate bars at people. The notion of soldiers throwing chocolate bars at people was completely alien to Germans. The Americans were physically huge, physically fit, and incredibly well supplied. Germans were quite simply amazed at these strange alien creatures. Every 10 years, years ending in 4 and 5, German newspapers run stories about how our town met the Americans, etc. It's a genre that I call the My First American story. I have dozens of them, and I'm fascinated by them because they follow a formula. Let me read one from a boy who grew up on a farm outside of Augsburg in southern Germany, writing about hiding in a barn with his mother. A soldier shone a powerful flashlight into the cellar and asked, "German soldiers here?" I answered in my schoolboy English, "No soldiers here." After the Americans were convinced, they asked if we had eggs. My mother looked through the supply of food that she carefully brought into the cellar and gave them 3. The soldier put the eggs carefully into his helmet, hung up his rifle, and handed each child a chocolate bar. With the exception of the fact that there's no cigarettes in this story, this is the perfect My First American story. It's a story of massive military power showing up literally on your doorstep. A terrifying force that could very easily tear you apart, but that ultimately hands you a chocolate bar and moves on. That story, much like the story about women and children in the rubble of cities, helps to understand why Germans were so willing to accommodate Americans. Now let us be clear about this. None of this was easy. There were places where American behavior was terrible. I'm happy to talk about that later on. There are places where American soldiers stole, where they raped, where they killed. There is no question about that. There is also no question that Germans were keenly aware that however bad the Americans were, the stories they were hearing about what was happening in the East, where the Soviets were far, far worse than anything they could see the Americans doing. So those are the first encounters, which I find absolutely fascinating and something, again, that I've spent a lot of time teaching and talking about. But now I want to shift our attention a little bit to the moments that follow. This is just here as kind of a primer. This is, I use this when I teach a remarkable number of people. If you take a German history course in the United States, there's a pretty good chance someone's going to flash this map up. It's really quite terrific. But let's just make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of geographic orientation. The American zone of occupation, southern and central Germany. This has everything to do with the position the United States Army had been in on the day of the invasion of Normandy. It quite simply has to do with how the armies had lined up in the great sweep that had cut through France and into Germany. We have the Americans in the south and the center. The great cities of Munich, Stuttgart, Frankfurt. We have the French along the French border, the British up here in the north, close of course to the North Sea, and then the Soviets in the east. Over here we have Silesia, from which our opening character comes from. But we have this division of Germany. So let's kind of make sure that we have the right geography here. After the initial push, after Germany's final surrender in May 1945, the United States, as part of the alliance, found itself in the remarkable position that it had to find a way to govern this new and broken place. So for the rest of the lecture, I want to talk about how that worked. I want to talk about those encounters in 1945 and 1946 beyond the first encounters. And there's a couple of points that I want to make, and again, I'd be more than happy to go into these in the Q&A, but I want to make sure that we leave plenty of time for that. There's a couple of points that I want to make here. The first is about government as a place of encounter. We talk about this period as the American occupation. We have here occupation areas. That's fine. America occupies this zone down here in some. Let's keep things in perspective. At their most, there were about 12,000 occupation troops. That is to say, troops engaged in military government. 12,000 in the American zone. The population of the American zone was somewhere order of 35 million people. The smallest occupation districts, rural districts in rural areas, small districts in rural areas, the smallest military government teams available were made up of 3 officers and 6 enlisted men. The county that I've written about in the book Strangers in the Wild Place that Sharon helpfully shared with you, a book that many, many copies still exist on Amazon, so I encourage you to buy that. This was a district that had about 20,000 Germans and about 40,000 Polish refugees, so-called displaced persons living in it. There were 3 American officers and 6 enlisted men. Of those 9 men, 0 of them spoke any German or any Polish. If we call this an occupation, we are doing serious violence to the word occupation. What does this mean? It means that the Americans desperately needed to bring German experts in as quickly as they could. German partners. The problem was that many of those partners had problematic pasts. So we talk about denazification, something, again, I'd be delighted to talk about in the Q&A. I often get the question, was denazification a success or a failure? The answer I give is yes. It was effectively impossible to govern this shattered, broken population without bringing in Germans, even if that meant not asking a whole lot of questions about what they had done during the years of Nazi rule. This happens across the board. You cannot get a city functioning again until the trams work. And if it happens that the one guy who knows how to make the trams work had a problematic past during the previous 12 years, This raises serious questions about how you're going to get the trams working. Same with the gas works, same with municipal administration, same with taxes. A lot of questions didn't get asked, and when they did get asked, this caused serious inconvenience for the occupiers, because the occupiers simply could not occupy without the active cooperation of Germans with whom they could communicate. And that issue of communication brings me to my second point, which is about language, something I find absolutely fascinating. Best guess is that in 1945, about 12% of Germans could speak some English. 12%. And these were mostly the educated elite. If you had any kind of education whatsoever in foreign languages in Germany in the 1940s, you probably knew French, but probably not English. So the number of people who could actually functionally communicate with you in English was really low. Now there's this story that Americans tell ourselves, and it is a cliche of World War II movies, that the person who could do the communicating in the unit was that guy who was a German immigrant. We've all seen those movies, Band of Brothers, take your pick. And yes, there is no question, there were plenty of German immigrants available who, in the US Army who grew up speaking German and could basically communicate. But there weren't many. And in a vast, spread out, desperately undermanned occupation, there certainly weren't enough to be in every rural district, every county, even every city. It's actually much more complicated than that. The Americans tried to teach Germans English using the medium of radio. When radio started functioning again in Munich, one of the first radio programs to be broadcast to the people of Bavaria was called, I'm not making this up, Englisch macht Spaß. English is fun. The idea being, we desperately needed people to be able to understand basic things in English. The other wrinkle on this is that there were Germans who learned English in a very sort of understandable way. They had grown up in the United States. Germans who had come over, either as children or their parents had come over, and then in the 1930s, when America was in the grips of the Depression and Adolf Hitler seemed to have a solution, had moved back to Germany. I encountered an extraordinary account of the American arrival in the German city of Gießen, not far from Frankfurt, in which the Americans got there. They had no one who spoke German. They were trying to figure out what to do, and two teenagers showed up, and an incredibly broad Brooklyn accent said, "How yous guys doing?" And it turned out that they were the translators. These two teenagers who'd grown up in Brooklyn, their parents had come back in the 1930s. Again, if it had been up to the Americans, this would not have worked. It worked because of that extraordinary transatlantic relationship that already existed. Language is incredibly important in this story, even if we don't necessarily like to think about such prosaic things in the grand story of the American occupation. Another area that I want to talk about is work. And this, I think, is an absolutely remarkable story. Again, something I've written about in other contexts. If the United States didn't have enough troops, specialized troops in Germany to govern, they certainly didn't have enough to perform the basic work that needed to be done to get a society back on its feet. The German economy was broken. The cash economy was effectively dead outside of a few sort of narrow uses, which I'm happy to talk about in another context. But the occupation desperately needed workers, so they began to hire Germans. Sometimes those Germans had skills, sometimes they didn't, sometimes they were coming directly out of POW or internment camps. You can see these men here working in Munich, some of whom are clearly wearing bits of military uniform. These were in some cases some of the only clothing that people had. By the end of 1945, I find this number astonishing, more than 250,000 Germans were working for the American occupation forces, mostly in manual labor positions. 250,000. One of the benefits for working for the Americans is the Americans paid in hot food, something that was exceedingly valuable in a society that was still coming to grips with starvation. One of the most absolutely remarkable things about this, and I almost feel like sometimes I'm making this up, but I promise you that I'm not, is that as early as late 1945, the US Army made the astonishing decision to allow those 250,000 German workers to unionize, which meant that German civilians working for the US Army in Europe were unionized at a time where American workers working for the US Army in the United States were not unionized. Why is this? It's actually very simple and profoundly cynical. Because the Soviet Union, in their occupation zone, was promoting itself as a workers' paradise and telling the workers that the Americans were capitalists who were trying to drain their blood and exploit their labor. And the Americans recognized that they had to make an active and affirmative case that work conditions, food, and good pay. And the darndest thing was, it worked. German workers in the employ of the United States military would remain an absolutely critical feature of the German economy on through the rest of the next 40 years. For most of the next 40 years, more than 75,000 Germans at any given time were working for the US Army. In states where the US Army would be concentrated, they would be the third, fourth, fifth biggest employer behind the chemical industries in some cases. Absolutely astonishing. In 1975, the US Army came to the conclusion that they might well have a number of workers who had remained in their posts since 1945 and set out to identify them. They discovered, and this guy's name sticks with me, a Yugoslav refugee named Jokan Maksimovic, who started working for the US Army in March 1945 during the invasion of Germany and was still working there in 1975 doing exactly the same job. Germans proved remarkably loyal to the United States military because the United States military paid well and generally had pretty good working conditions. Again, this relationship should not have worked, and yet somehow it did. Work, government, language. These became critical places where Germans and Americans interacted with each other, learned about each other. And that learning process is where I want to go next. I chose this picture for a reason. No penalty if you don't know where this is. This is the Bürgerbräu Keller in Munich. Bürgerbräu Keller is known for one thing and one thing only. Anybody? Bürgerbräu Keller? Beer hall? Beer hall putsch. Yes, in November 1923. So if you go to Munich today, there are unscrupulous tour guides that will take you by the Hofbräuhaus and tell you this is where the beer hall putsch happened. They are lying. It happened at the Bürgerbräu Keller, which has this weird post-beer hall putsch history because in 1938, at a ceremony to commemorate the beer hall putsch, a German an electrician named Georg Elser tried to assassinate Adolf Hitler. During the war, this place was largely bombed. So it was fairly heavily damaged. Again, I'm not making this up. Today, it is the public library. So it is the Gasteig Public Library in Munich. So if you want to see where the beer hall putsch happened, the story, I'm ranting about this. I do this because it makes me so mad. The story of the beer hall putsch makes no sense if it happened at the Hofbräuhaus. It actually happens at the public library. So if you're in Munich, find the public library. That's that. All right. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. After the war, the remains of the Bürgerbräu Keller became the enlisted man's club for the US Army in Munich, which meant that it became an out-of-bounds zone for Germans. In December 1945, the Americans allowed a single German reporter for a newly reopened paper, the Münchner Neueste Nachrichten, to come and spend a day in the enlisted man's club in the Bürgerbräu Keller. The reporter wrote this really long report about what the Americans were doing in this forbidden zone. Rarely in my research do I laugh out loud, and this time I did. This thing was great. It's excerpting from a much longer article. American soldiers, called in American GI. This is written in German, my translation. This abbreviated word, pronounced GI, means the same as poilu in French or Lanzer in German. Great, all right, so we are already seeing, this is the learning process. They're using this, GI, what on earth does that mean? Oh, GI, there's a little pronunciation guide here, I like that. And then there's a bit about what you can buy in the snack bar at the enlisted man's club. During the afternoon of the snack bar, there is coffee and a kind of Bavarian pastry that in American is called a donut. That made me so happy, because this may be one of the first uses in the German language of the word donut. And today, if you go into a German bakery, you will find in every last one of them donuts. They will be bad. The worst donut shop in Greenville, Texas has better donuts than a German bakery, but by God, they know what a donut is. Except in 1945, they didn't know. They called it a type of Bavarian pastry called, in American, a donut. Like I said, when I saw that story about Werner Holtzinger, I thought, that's how I'm going to start my talks. And when I saw the line about the donut, I was like, yeah, this is how I'm wrapping things up. This is a moment. It is an extraordinary moment. A moment in which a German reporter finds himself in the heart of a new and odd kind of foreign presence in a city that had been so prototypically German. A city the Nazis considered the heartland of the movement, the capital city of the movement. It was a city that had a long and proud tradition, its own history, now in the grips of a foreign invader, but a different kind of invader. An invader that came not to bring tyranny and destruction, but to bring a type of Bavarian pastry called a donut. We don't need to tell this story in a way that glamorizes or that smooths over the rough parts, the conflicts, the misunderstandings, the violence, or the horrors that everyone had experienced during the years that had come previously. What we do have to accept, and what we have to understand, is that the relationship that would develop over the next 8 decades, that continues to this day, was founded in these terrible days as war transitioned to peace, as enemies transitioned to occupiers, as hostile civilians transitioned to curious subjects, and as a new type of rule developed in a country that had been through 12 years of tyranny, of war, of moral bankruptcy, and of destruction. If we are going to understand this remarkable transformation of Germany and Central Europe from a foe that had committed some of the most terrible crimes in recorded history to a part of a Western European and Atlantic community, we have to begin at the beginning, because, I would argue, that beginning offers us clues to a strange but extraordinary future ahead. Thank you very much.
Susan, you got the microphone? I've got 15 questions.
All right, well, if you guys have time.
You always see the ladies cleaning brick.
Yep.
And they're in their Sunday best clothes.
Yep.
Is that all they had?
I mean, you also, these are the so-called the Trümmerfrauen, the rubble women. Yes, you do see that. You also see them out in work clothes, sometimes taken from the factories where they had worked during the war. I mean, yeah. I think there's, yes, it is, as I said, this is an extraordinarily female moment. And there's a lot that follows on from that, but the absence of men is really quite notable in the German cityscapes.
Middle back there. Raise your hand. Who raised your hand?
Oh, yep.
Very good.
There you go.
Thank you, Dr. Seipp.
Sure.
Incredibly informative. Question I have, we know that at the end of the war, the German military preferred and wanted to be captured by the Allies and American forces versus the Soviets. Right after the war, Operation Paperclip seems like the first time that the Americans now were going after who the Germans were, especially Werner von Braun and the engineers at the VT, or the V2 project. Do you feel like that America was doing that because of just a national, let's get information about the rockets, or was it that the United States were learning that our ally is now going to be a future enemy?
Yeah, great question. So I think the answer is both. I think there was definitely a sense certainly by the middle of 1945 that the Soviets were going to be a real problem. And that the Americans needed to get some of these folks out of Europe as quickly as possible. both for the benefit of the Americans and for the detriment of the Soviets. Both of those, I think, are really, really interesting. I mean, Operation Paperclip, and here I want to highly recommend my colleague and friend Brian Krim has written a really terrific book about this. It is a small program. It's about 1,200 people. And yes, some of those people had deeply, deeply problematic pasts, particularly the use of slave labor in the rocket programs. So I don't want to minimize that at all. I do want to stress Operation Paperclip was in a massive post-war situation. It was a tiny, tiny program, but there's no question it was important. Thanks for asking.
Thank you.
Hi. So, as you know, in America, post-World War II, there was a large baby boom.
Yeah.
Was there a similar thing in Germany between the German women and the American soldiers at the time?
Oh, what a great question. Yeah, I could go on about this. All right. So no. The German baby boom actually ticks. You can look at comparative baby booms. The German baby boom doesn't start until a couple of years after the American one does, just because of this weird demography of the war. So there is no German women, American men baby boom, although it must have seemed like it. I'll tell you where there was, and that is in the displaced persons camps. This is. I'll say this as carefully. So in the camps for Jewish displaced persons, survivors of concentration camps and forced labor, many of whom had fled from Poland, had some of the highest birth rates ever recorded in a human population in the wake of the war. And it is very, very clear that for some of those young couples, every baby born was a victory over Hitler. And it was a finger held up to the Nazi regime that had done its best to destroy them. So there was a baby boom going on in Germany in 1945 and 1946, but it was in the 20-some. And I want to stress, the Jewish displaced persons camps were almost all in the American zone, because the United States was the only one of the Western allies that recognized the specific suffering of Jews as Jews and created specific camps for Jews. So that's something that is that in effect, the center of Jewish life in the world in 1945 was New York, maybe a little bit of Chicago, and a bunch of camps in the southern part of Germany. Which is, I've always said, if you like irony, World War II is your war. And the fact that essentially the center of European Jewish life was in southern Germany in 1945 is absolutely astonishing. So that doesn't actually answer your question, but it needs to be said. So thank you for asking it.
I'd like to comment without a microphone. I have a voice. I was born in 1933, and our people came up the Mississippi River and settled in Quincy, Illinois, about 120 miles north of St. Louis. And as a teenager, listening late in the morning to the early part of the war was very discouraging. But in relationship to my colleagues or my other friends, we did not brag about being a German. But basically we were in a community that had established by many Germans as well as other nationalities. So
Absolutely.
it was just part of growing up at that age. It was very scary to, as a 14-year-old, to have Hiroshima and atomic bombs and what we had to look forward to.
I think the story of Texas as a multi-ethnic, multilingual state in the first half of the 20th century is absolutely fascinating, and we certainly have a lot of students who are interested in that. And
The melting pot.
Yeah, and the story of German-American Texans and German-Americans generally is really a fascinating one during this period. So thank you for sharing that, sir.
So how many German ancestry guys were in Germany after the war?
So we don't actually know. Yeah, we don't have it. We don't. It's hard to get a number on that. There were. Again, I'm going to not answer your question, but answer another question, which is that there were programs to bring German Americans to Germany. The most famous are the so-called Camp Ritchie boys, the largely German and Austrian Jews who trained at Camp Ritchie, Maryland, and went back to Germany as interrogators. And these guys, after the war, were accused of torturing Nazi prisoners, and several of them responded Yeah, we did that, and it in fact got a couple of convictions quashed later on. But that story is itself really so there are places in which the United States actually sort of actively used that German-American connection for post-war ends. So there's some really fascinating aspects to this, and again, there's some really good scholarship on this. But please, yeah.
I was just wondering if you could speak to the events that led to the construction of the Berlin Wall.
Yeah. So the Berlin Wall, so the division of got a map. Everybody loves a map. All right, so we have, again, I don't think I need to tell the folks in this room this, but we have the four-power occupation and then the four-power occupation of Berlin within the Soviet zone. And so what's fascinating about this is that for the next 15 years, 15 years, the border was fairly porous in Berlin. It wasn't super easy, but you could move from one side of the city to the other. Effectively, it was a sort of outpost of free movement in an increasingly divided Europe. So what happens you have the Berlin blockade in 1948 and 1949, which really was precipitated by efforts to create a separate Western German currency. And then 13 years later, the construction of the Berlin Wall, which really, despite what the East Germans said, was an effort to stop the brain drain, where anybody who had an education, had professional prospects, would leave East Germany through Berlin and make it to the West. It's so important. This seems, again, back to language. There were lots of places, Poland, Hungary, where if all you spoke was Polish or Hungarian, and you lived in Poland or Hungary, you really could, if you left, what were you going to do? If you were a lawyer in Hungary and you only spoke Hungarian and you could make it to the West, you couldn't practice law. But in East Germany, if you were a lawyer or a dentist or an engineer, you could get to the West and continue practicing in the same language. That's really important. There was an incentive to get to the West. There's a story, so some of you will know that East Germany is the German Democratic Republic, or DDR. And so the abbreviation is DDR in German. And one famous German historian has joked that DDR stood for Dumb Dudes Remain, which is a great line. But it speaks to this problem of brain drain. Great, thank you.
Hi, I have a question about this moment for women. I was wondering if with this, this splurge of women, were there any reforms that came with that?
So, thanks for asking that. I wish I could say there was. And in fact, what you see is a really strong counter-reaction. So if we look at the late 1940s, so in 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany became an independent country again, the three Western zones. And it's not coincidental that the first governments, really for the first 15 years of the Federal Republic, were socially conservative governments. And there is no question that what you might call the rollback of women's rights in the 1950s, the development of a deeply socially conservative ethos in West Germany, was a response to the post-war period and a feeling that German women had somehow forgotten their place. Now, it wasn't nearly the way the Nazis had. Nazis were kind of obsessed with German women being in the house and having children and serving the state. It wasn't nearly to that level. But I think what you see is a really dramatic counter-reaction, and that doesn't really begin to change until the 1970s, when that post-war generation, the young adults born at the end of the war, they were the ones who would say, no, we're not going to stay the way it was. We want something new. And this is where you see the women's movement, you see fights over issues like abortion that really don't come roaring back out in Germany until the 1970s. There's a sort of period in which a lot of these things aren't discussed, and there isn't that kind of energy for reform. It sort of skips a generation. So it's a terrific question, and it's a puzzling thing to have to teach, why this apparent moment of the woman doesn't last.
Time for an attorney to talk.
Why did Eisenhower defer going into Berlin at the time that the Soviets were coming in from the other direction?
Yeah. really important question. The fact of the matter was the Red Army had just fought its way across Eastern Europe. Red Army was massive. It had absorbed huge numbers of casualties, but it had also learned it was a really effective fighting formation in 1945. This wasn't the kind of a poorly led, poorly equipped army that Hitler had encountered at the beginning of Operation Barbarossa. There was absolutely no conceivable way that even with its Western allies, the United States could have taken a military position contrary to the Red Army. I think Berlin was going to fall with the Soviets. I think this gets to a larger issue, which is that we have this story in the United States that the United States sold out Eastern Europe at the end of the war, allowing the communists to overrun Eastern Europe. The fact of the matter was the Red Army had fought its way across Eastern Europe at enormous costs in its own blood, and the Red Army had fought its way across the Soviet Union and seen the devastation left behind by the German army. This was not an army that was going to stop short of its strategic objectives. And we didn't give Eastern Europe to the Soviets took it. And there was simply no appetite for any kind of confrontation that might bring the Red Army into conflict with the Western Allies. So I think it was a deeply pragmatic decision on Eisenhower's part. Also worth noting, Berlin was very stoutly defended, and about 250,000 casualties. There's about 100,000 Soviet soldiers killed in the fall of Berlin. These are people who died literally in the last days of the war to destroy a city. I was joking about this earlier. The Gestapo, the German secret police, they were obsessed with political jokes. So if they would write down jokes that people told as a way potentially of prosecuting them. But at the end of the war, there was a joke circulating in Berlin that the best way to get from the Eastern Front to the Western Front was on the Berlin city subway system. Like, that's how bad things were. But anyway, yeah, thanks for asking that.
So your map up there, where you're talking about the occupation zones, it made me think of the Spandau prison.
Yeah.
Which was, if I'm not mistaken, was on the western sphere of occupation, yet the Soviets insisted on sending a crew there for their return.
Yes.
Any insight as to why they would waste those resources for people already convicted and in a prison?
Pure pride. Just an acknowledgement. So Berlin remained under four-power occupation until 1990. So any Allied effort in Berlin had to be a four-power endeavor. So Spandau Prison, which by the end held one prisoner, Rudolf Hess, who happened to live longer than the rest of them. So it was a prison guarded by troops from 4 different armies that guarded one guy. It's absolutely absurd. But it speaks to the sort of symbolic politics of Berlin. And to back away from that would have meant conceding that the Soviets might not have a right to everything in divided Berlin. So absolutely pure politics.
About 8 or 10 years ago, Angela Merkel welcomed several million Syrian refugees into Germany. And a few years back on a vacation tour, our German guide explained to us that the reason it seemed like the German people allowed their heart to overcome their head, you might say, in that instance is because that after World War II, there were so many displaced people in the cities that families went to live with strangers in the countryside. And he said the German people, even today, are very sympathetic with refugees and homeless people. Do you think that makes sense?
Absolutely. So let me just provide some context here. So this is enormously complicated, and I'll try to distill this down as quickly as I can. In the wake of the war, so I talked about the displaced persons. The displaced persons were initially about 7 million foreigners. They were all non-Germans, Poles, Ukrainians mostly, who had mostly been in forced labor facilities. So they were cared for by the Allies. What I think your guide was talking about were the so-called ethnic German expellees. These were people from Eastern Europe. There were large German populations all over Eastern Europe in places like Silesia, where Werner Holzinger was from, the Sudetenland here along the border, and as far east as the interior of Russia. Either they were driven or or they came voluntarily in fear of their lives to Germany in the wake of the war. The East Germans didn't want them. They came to West Germany. We are talking about approximately 12 million people. It is the biggest refugee flow in human history. This is larger than the refugee flow created by the partition of India and Pakistan. This is bigger than any other refugee crisis that we know of in human history. And they are coming into devastated cities. There is no place for them. It changed the makeup changed the religious makeup of Germany. It changed the cultural makeup of Germany. It was absolutely profound. This is a story that is just simply not told outside of Germany. It is an extraordinary story. And yes, I absolutely believe that so there's that, and then there's the rock-solid German commitment after World War II to building a democracy based on the concept of human rights because of what had happened during the Nazi period. So those two things, that memory of displacement and the foundational constitutional commitment of post-war Germany to human rights, helps to explain why Germans were, in 2015, considerably more willing, I think, than anyone expected to take in large numbers of refugees. Let me add one more thing to that. One of the places so when all these Syrian refugees, Syrians, Eritreans, etc., began to come to Germany, the Germans had to find some place to put them. And one of the few places you could put them was on disused American Army bases. So if you go today to the city of Heidelberg, there is a large housing community outside of Heidelberg, Patrick Henry Village, that was built for American troops in 1954. Today, it houses refugees from Syria. So, if you want to understand this sort of serial wave of displacement that happens into, out of, through Germany, you can't find many better places than Patrick Henry Village to explain that. Thanks a lot for asking that.
Seipp, in keeping with our theme for 2025, the events that occurred that hastened the end of the war. Looking at the whole German war, 41 to 45, what was the singular most important military event that occurred that hastened the end of the war and let it occur at the end of April, early May of 45 rather than 46 or 47? What's your opinion?
Oh, yeah. In my opinion, the singular event that hastens the end of the war is the German invasion of the Soviet Union. This was, the Germans started a war they were in absolutely no position to win. The German invasion of the Soviet Union has got to be regarded as one of the great military disasters of human history, an act of boneheadedness that if in any other country, in any sane civil military relationship, any plan that involved a mass invasion of a huge landmass on the end of or in the middle of the Eurasian continent without sufficient fuel, agricultural resources, men, etc., would have been considered enough folly to get its planners sent to an insane asylum. In Germany, it became national policy. At this point, effectively, the Germans had overreached. But of course, then one then has to ask, if the Nazis hadn't invaded the Soviet Union, they wouldn't have been Nazis. This was a regime that was ideologically committed to the notion that it both should and could dominate Europe and the world. And that overrode any notion of strategic sense. So, yes, I mean, to me, that's the clear moment at which, and of course, there are other moments. I mean, I think, Churchill famously, when the Americans get involved, Churchill begins saying, yep, this is a turning point. There are other moments along the way. Let me just add one more thing to this, because I think this is important for an American audience. I think when Americans think about critical moments for the end of the war, one of the dates that pops up is June 6th, 1944, the Normandy invasion. We have to consider that same month the Soviets launch the crushing of Army Group Center, which is, by any standard, the largest battle ever fought by human armies, ever, ever, ever. Normandy was a sideshow. However, it is a critical sideshow if you live in Paris, or in Rome, or in Munich, or in Stuttgart, because it means you would be liberated by the Americans, or the French, or the or the British or the Canadians. You would not be liberated by the Soviets. Normandy, perhaps not critical in ending the war for 1945, but it sure is critical for 1955 and 1965 and 2025. Those are, I think that is a key point that we've got to put on that. That is a very long answer to what should have been a very short question, but that's World War II for you.
My next door neighbor would remind you that in 1943 he was driving a truck from Karamshah, Persia, across to Georgia and supplying Russia and saving their lives that way. What about the Marshall Plan? It seemed to take place a little slow. And how did it get named after General Marshall?
Well, I mean, it's General Marshall when he's Secretary of State who becomes the kind of intellectual architect for this. I think that, the Marshall Plan is both an economic mechanism, it's critical for the recovery of Europe. It's also very much political. It's designed as probably know, the countries have to opt in, and it was an implicit or explicit repudiation of Stalin. It was both an extraordinary act of Cold War generosity and a cynical act of Cold War politics at the same time. Probably not possible earlier than it was. There was a tremendous amount of just simple basic recovery that had to happen. There had to be institutions that were capable of processing Marshall Plan aid before the Marshall Plan was actually, the European Recovery Program, as it was also known, could actually be actualized. I mean, part of what I didn't talk about today was how important these local institutions were. I talked about the need for German partners, but the fact was those partners needed something to do. So pretty quickly after the war, you see the establishment of local governments and then state governments. We have a lot of capacity building that happens very, very quickly. Without that, the Marshall Plan would have been simply sort of pouring sand into the water.
Well, we have a guy from Deeport, Texas, that was on the board of Time magazine, and a lawyer in New York City, and he was the assistant to Mr. Kaufman, is that right? For those 2, 3, or 4 years. Anybody written about any of that?
Oh gosh, I'm gonna have to get back to you on that. But I mean, there's a lot of good books on the Marshall Plan, but I'll have to get back to you on that.
We're just now discovering that in Deeport, Texas.
Excuse my voice, I'm allergies. I'm going to jump forward a whole bunch. What's happening in Germany now with the far right rising and the question of maybe our troops taking off? Talk to me about that a little bit.
That's a small question. Yeah. So a couple of things. I mean, I think those of you who might follow Europe a little bit know that Germany just had an election in which the far right did fairly well. They didn't do as well. So I'm not a fan of the German far right Alternative for Germany party. All of you are entitled to your own political opinions, but I'm not a fan. So I was relieved. They did a couple of points less. If they are a few points, move a few points in the polls, I think that becomes a real challenge to the mainstream Democratic parties in Germany. I think they probably weren't helped by the German reaction to the American elections. I think, broadly speaking, the German public opinion feels fairly strongly about the current shape of the United States government, and I think we can leave well enough alone on that point. I think so. The other part of your question was about the American troops. So this is an ongoing issue. It is clear that there are differences of opinion in the U.S. government about the role that the United States can and should play in NATO. And these are constructive discussions, and people in this room are going to have different opinions about it. There are currently about 35,000 American troops in Germany and several tens of thousands in Italy as well. There are also, there is an a lot of Americans don't know this, there is a U.S. Fifth Corps, U.S. Army Fifth Corps, which was in Frankfurt for almost all of the Cold War, has its forward headquarters in Posen, Poland, which of course used to be Germany, Poznan. Fifth Corps is now positioned on the eastern flank of NATO. And the eastern flank of NATO is a pretty scary place to be right now because of the behavior of the Russians. So currently the United States is postured fairly far forward as part of a NATO screen against Russia. There are real questions about what that future looks like. It is my opinion, as an individual, as a historian who thinks about these things, that a continued American presence in Europe offers the United States, the ability to project power around the world. Germany is a lot closer to a lot of the places we're interested in than the United States is. It is my opinion that we have had a productive defense partnership with the Germans since the late 1940s when Germany reemerged as a sovereign state. The story I've been telling partly today. And it is my opinion that it would be unwise to withdraw precipitously from that. There are other opinions. I also think it's noteworthy that some of you may know that the commander of U.S. EUCOM, European Command, General Cavoli, the four-star commander of U.S. EUCOM, testified in Congress last week and got a very positive bipartisan hearing from Republicans and Democrats. And Cavoli is making the argument that the United States still has a role to play in European defense. There may be differences of opinion between the White House and Congress that emerge in the next couple of months. It is a space that I watch pretty closely. It's a space I'm very interested in as a historian and as an American. Again, I fully respect that there will be differences of opinion in this room. I'm prepared to defend my version of it, and I'm sure you're prepared to defend yours if yours is different. But thank you very much for that question, because it gave me a chance to answer something I was hoping I'd get to talk about.
Any more?
Well, thank you so much. We're
Thank you.
very wonderful.